with Soroush. So Soroush is currently a lead product designer at Lululemon with over 10 years of experience designing innovative user experiences and interactions. And we're really excited to have you today. So steal the show.
Awesome. Thanks for having me here. Let me just go ahead and share my screen so we can get started here. Can you all see my screen? I hope you can see my screen. Please say yes. Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Soroush Toloue. I'm a lead UI UX designer and accessibility evangelist. And I've been a passionate accessibility evangelist since 2016. And ever since that time, I've had the pleasure of working with some of the largest financial institutions in Canada, as well as government agencies, so BMOTD, Ministry of Education, Home Depot, ADP, and now at Lululemon. And today I want to chat, let me just check here, regarding some of the benefits of building and designing with accessibility in mind, and what are the practical tips that I would recommend for you as a designer to adopt, and some of the things that I share with my colleagues in terms of benefits and kind of a win-win situation as far as accessibility is concerned. So to me, accessibility is best considered early and often. The analogy that I often use is like the electricity of a building or a house. If you haven't built a house with electricity or a building with electricity in mind, from the get-go, you're going to be in trouble later down the line. Even though retrofitting is possible, it's not, recommended. It is best to consider accessibility as early and as often as you can. So, how would we go about doing that? The two things I would tackle on as a UX designer is one, the first of all, is the idea of a cognitive load, meaning that most of the UI that you see is too confusing. There are too many things going on, especially nowadays with levels of anxiety being at an all-time high. The cognitive load for everyone is too high. So the more simplified you could make the steps involved, as well as the UI, the better it'll be. So the steps, meaning the flows, the number of steps it'll take to accomplish any given task. So if you can reduce that number to a small number, that would be super cool. As well as the UI architecture. If you look at Amazon in the previous generations, it was super heavy, but now everything is simplified and customized, and with the right information or hierarchy, and leads to things like that, so that you guide the user's eye with the headers, with the right information that they want to see. So there's hierarchy involved, so that it's easy to recognize. So it's not all on the same level scale. And that goes into using proper HTML tags like H1, H2, body, and so on and so forth. So this will really help, especially folks who are non-sighted, if you've used the proper HTML tags to 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 get the right information, right? So this is at the header level. Okay, now I understand it. This is at a body level. Now I understand it. So it really helps to follow those things through. I also see a lot of UIs that are looking like this. That means there are no instructional text. So this again makes it super hard for non-sighted users to figure out what's going on without having to tap through the experience or have the assistive technology read through all the interactive elements for them, which again doesn't help to tell what's going on within this UI. So a simple line of instructional text along with a header would go a long way to helping the user to see what to expect, what to do without having to scroll, so on and so forth. So I would highly recommend titles and instructional text for almost every screen. The other thing that I see that as a designers we could always improve on is the color contrast that we use, the kind of colors that we use for fonts and and for interactive items. So these are bad examples. As you can see, there isn't enough color contrasts, meaning the font is too small, the color behind the text is not too gray, so there isn't enough contrast, so that you would have to squint, or in most cases this would fail. And so this is not a good example or a good design in my opinion. Also pushing for native HTML tags. I know we are designers, we're not developers, but if again we could have a say in the front end to make sure that the proper HTML tags, so like the header, the side, the main, these things, again, if you're having the experience read out to you, would help you a great deal to figure out which part of the UI you're talking about. As well as in general, it is a great practice to follow JAWS, NVIDIA, and VoiceOver, as these are industry standard tools for assistive technologies, meaning that non-sighted users or people who need assistive um, technologies could leverage these tools. And VoiceOver is actually free. JAWS used to be free as well. So I highly encourage you to take through these tools and making sure that your app or your final product does work with these tools. This is highly important. And if you do that, that means all the search engines in the world, Google included, would support your app. So it has has a lot of benefits. The other thing to consider as a designer is to consider alt text. And alt text that are descriptive. Alt text meaning that you provide an alternative way of reading this image. So again, if you have lower vision, or if you cannot, or for many reasons you cannot see this image, there's an alternative text with a descriptive saying that hand reaching for a yellow apple hanging from the tree. This is super descriptive, as if you would explain it to a friend over the phone, right? And again, if you don't do the alt text, some assistive technologies or some screen readers may result to reading file names, which again, if you haven't done a good job of naming your files, this could happen. So IMG, this could be read out to the user instead of QCat, right? WebAIM is a great resource for accessibility, does a great job for keyboard-only users. And one of the things that it helps with keyboard-only users is instead of tabbing through complicated navigations, like 20 navigation items to go get through and tab through to get to the main content, they have this skip to main content. And I'll just demonstrate very, very quickly for you guys. So yeah, if let's say I want to get to this main content and don't want to tab through the navigation, I would come in here. There's a skip to main contents link for me as a keyboard only user. I hit that and boom, now I'm inside the content and I can navigate from there, as opposed to going through this complicated navigation. I would highly recommend all designers to start adapting these practices. Again, for keyboard only users, this is very, very important. They don't want to go through all these navigations to get to the main content. Similar with images, it could be very lazy to just dump an image in here without any explanation, but this is what we should do as web designers or professionals. We should be writing this out in text form, because again, if you have a, let's say, crummy internet connection or something like that, the images could be pixelated, you could not discern the text properly, so always good to have a text format of this thing available. You could always have a PDF version of it as well, but do not do text inside images. Always have the text alone by itself. Also, if you're doing video, I highly encourage you to do the captions again, because if you have captions are good, and captions will also help. Again, if you're in a crowded bar or something like that, captions will always help to reach your video to more people. I would also encourage you to include a transcript, or you could include the transcript either in a file, or you could just write it out in your website or in your app. Show keyboard-only users, again, some love by making sure that your hover effects are proper. So again, WebAIM does a good job of making sure that when you're hovering over items as a keyboard-only user, you can clearly discern them and you can clearly and easily interact with them. So not only that these are recognizable, you have to make sure that your app, as a keyboard-only user, I can do all the tasks that a mouse user or any other users can do. So if it's shopping, a keyboard-only user must be able to shop. If it's getting an airline ticket, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we talked about accessibility will benefit all the search engines, so that's a duplicate. So these are the kind of stuff that I talk about with my partners and product owners and BAs and everyone else in the product lifecycle about accessibility and why it's important. And I use real life examples such as this, that the ramp at the mall that you see is not only for wheelchair users, it's for people who are older, who are on a stroller with a baby, who are lazy like myself, or like, for a number of people. This helps, and it helps a variety of people. So it's another example of saying that if you do the accessibility thing, if you do the right thing, it benefits all. Same thing with the automatic doors, especially nowadays with the pandemic and everything. You don't want to touch things. So this again is another example of accessibility that is helping a society as a whole. Texting, I often remind people that it was initially invented for the deaf community, and now we all benefit from SMS texting. So again, and I also remind them that accessibility could be temporary. I used to joke around and say, hey, what if you went skiing and you broke your arm? Does that mean you should stop using your app? Does that mean you should stop using your phone? No, right? There should be alternative ways of interacting with your phone other than your thumbs. Or that's when voice UX or the voiceover thing comes into play. So, and again, if you do the accessibility thing right, you will reach more users, you will reach more SEO, search engine optimization, and you will in turn make more revenue. So doing the right thing really does pay off. And some resources for you is WebAIM, as I mentioned, is a great example of a website that you could check out, and it's awesome. Axe DevTools is another tool that was originally created by Google, if I'm not mistaken, that you can submit any website to DevTools, and it will give you a accessibility report regarding color contrast, regarding all the things that you should be in compliant with. So Axe DevTools, highly recommended. Deque is another resource for accessibility learning and education. If you are working with a large organization, please recommend Deque to them, because it's a great resource and it's a proven that across the board it educates top 500 companies, and it's an industry standard tool. Accessible colors, again, is another thing that as a UX designer can go in to make sure that every design that you submit, your colors are accessible. And you can also look for the Figma or Sketch extensions for accessibility, which I'm sure you can find. And that is it. That is my spiel. And I will leave now time for questions and answers. And I have to check my spelling. But yeah.
Thank you so much, Soroush, for that amazing presentation and for highlighting how important it is to add accessibility features. And it's true that one feature can be helpful for so many different kinds of people. So we got a question. So how do you collect data to improve accessibility? What are some ethical issues that you could run into?
So collecting data, you could run into it potentially, but I'm sure if you go to your HR professional and say, this is the thing that we are doing, we want to make sure that we don't want to spend all our resources for all accessibility, all aspects of accessibility. We want to make sure we have a targeted approach. And if you don't mind letting us know who are the people who are working with us, if they have any accessibility needs, we can make sure to prioritize those needs first.
Are there any particular, I guess, tools that you use as a researcher to collect this kind of data?
So you could use usertesting.com or any kind of user testing or user research kind of tool that you want. It's up to you. But it's good to do research. It's good to have an evidence-based approach in all of it to say, hey, based on this research, we've done this improvement and that saved the company X amount of dollars. And so, yeah.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So I actually had a question. You were talking about how important it is that, although you're a designer, it's really important that you have input in the front end development and communication with that team. So I was just wondering, as a designer, do you recommend that young designers today familiarize themselves with front end development? And if so, which programming languages or which aspects would you emphasize on them knowing about?
I would highly recommend any young designer to know HTML and CSS and a little bit of JavaScript. HTML and CSS is basically the structure, and CSS is the visual, the bone, the look and feel of it, right? So knowing that will give you confidence when talking with developers, would also earn you a huge amount of respect if you can, make a judgment call that says, hey, this is a small CSS change, therefore we can squeeze it into the sprint. It won't take too much time because I happen to know it won't take too much time. And but don't rub it in. I wouldn't recommend, like, staying in your lane as a designer. Don't just like uh, don't have opinions on everything, but know your stuff.
Yeah, it's definitely important to have that like cross-functionality knowledge. And next question is, I was wondering, how would you approach the use of at text for mobile?
The alt text for mobile.
Alt text for mobile, yes.
Um, so so regardless of the platform you're in, you have to make sure that when you put an image in a design, that you work with your content developer or content writer to come up with the alternative text for that image. And that is regardless of the platform diagnostic or device, agnostic, if that answers your question. So regardless of the device, mobile, iPad, desktop, you have to provide an alt text.
Sounds good. So alt text is really important, I'm hearing.
Yes.
Just waiting on to see if there's any other questions flowing in.
Because if you don't do some of these practices, it could be argued that you are running some kind of discriminatory practices against a certain group, or you're not including them. Therefore, you run the risk of being sued by those people. And this is the last resort that I use to convince businesses to do the right thing. But yeah.
So that being said, like there are very different users. Like there's a wide variety of concerns that you have to address. So how do you ensure that like you're, I guess attacking all those concerns and making sure you don't get sued?
I would say following industry standards and best practices is the best thing, you know? So when the industry best practice says on every page, have an H1 tag, that is your header that says welcome or whatever, do that, right? When it's you think it's beneficial to have some kind of instructional text to explain what this page is about, do that, right? And the color contrast and everything else that came up as a designer, I think the list isn't super long, right? You could simply go through this list and check box and everything to make sure that, you know, everything is kosher, as it were. Um, but yeah, it's not as overwhelming as you might think.
That's great to hear. So next question, what are some groups that you would say are commonly overlooked?
I would say keyboard only users, color, people with lower vision, people with cognitive issues, so memory issues, dyslexia, um, and people who use assistive technologies like JAWS, NVIDIA, and VoiceOver, so are often overlooked. Because there's this argument that, vast majority of our users won't need this stuff, right? And let's just build for them, which from a human rights perspective is not the greatest approach to take. And therefore, yeah, I wouldn't recommend taking that approach. You have to be inclusive. You have to include everyone. You are designing for everyone.
Yeah, it's definitely like unfair to just exclude some people or, make a product that isn't available for everyone. Um, so just out of curiosity, like you seem really passionate about this topic. So just wondering, like, what got you into designing for everyone? And I remember earlier in the design panel, you were also saying how you want to ensure that your designs are meant to like solve problems and to really improve people's lives. So just curious about that.
So I watched a TED talk of a small person describing their experience using a public bathroom and how embarrassing and how dehumanizing that is. And it just made me ashamed to my core as a designer that I've been designing all these experiences for the longest time, and I haven't even considered this. Obviously we don't design physical things, but we design things that impact millions of people. So you have a huge responsibility as a designer to do the right thing for these people, um, and to be the voice of the voiceless kind of thing in the room. Because if you don't do it, nobody else will.
Yeah, that totally makes a lot of sense. And next question is, how do you address dyslexia in your designs?
So dyslexia is so some of the tips I would recommend is not using justified text, for example, because if you're using justified text, it puts automatic spaces in between the words, and those kinds of spaces can really trip up somebody with dyslexia. So making sure that you're not doing anything weird with your text in terms of like either write a line or left a line with text. Do not justify them like it's in a magazine or something. Don't do all these magazine things that you see that they do with text. Keep it as simple as possible. Make sure that everything is normal and standard. There aren't weird spaces in between your lines. Your line height is normal. Your word spacing is normal. Your letter spacing is normal, and that's about it.
Thank you for those tips. So, are there any examples that you'd like to show us that have reflected these accessibility problems being, discussed? Like, do you have any examples
Of examples of them being implemented?
of work that you've done that you might want to show us?
So
Talk
no,
about.
unfortunately, most of the work falls under NDA, and but what I would say is that my work at both TD and BMO was based on building design systems that made sure that every component was tested and was truly accessible. So many of those components made their way into the TD everyday banking apps, and same with the BMO app. And when I see my mom or someone like that uses them, makes me super proud.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for that. Um, so Kieran asks, there's always like a trade-off of simplicity and accommodation with design. So how do you find that sweet spot between those two aspects?
I don't think there's a trade-off, to be honest. I think simplicity is the North Star, and clutter is the opposite of that. So the more you can lean towards the thing, the less clutter, the better. But I may be wrong.
Um, but like sometimes, let's say if you're accommodating for like a lot of different types of users, do you ever feel that sometimes having to, I guess, be concerned about all these people? Like, does that sometimes affect your design? Do you have to sometimes give up something to ensure that you're you're like addressing all these people?
Yes. So prioritization, right? And that is why we are so lucky that we have an iterative approach into our ways of working, meaning that we have an MVP, so we could tackle people who are most being affected in the MVP first, making sure that those challenges are handled first, and then we can tackle the less important maybe at a later stage, 2 weeks, 6 months, whatever it is. But yeah, making those compromises or prioritizations is part of our job. But again, with all this, what I can do as a designer is only recommend. I can say this I think is priority number one. Would they code it as priority number one, or would the project management team do it as priority number one? That is out of my control.
Yeah, that's understandable. It's always hard to satisfy everyone. Um,
But the more evidence you have, right,
mhm.
evidence tends to make everyone quiet, especially if you turn that evidence into a dollar amount that speaks universal language.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you so much. So I don't think we have any more questions for today, but thank you so much for that wonderful session. You gave so many tips and insights on designing for accessibility, and thank you so much for having us today.
Thank you. It was an honor to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.